Hello, team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine news update, geopolitical update that I haven't done for many days. It's long overdue, and so it's an accumulation of topics over the last sort of 3 days. I'm keeping my voice low because I'm in a place where it's quite late at night, and I don't want to um, upset anyone around here who's trying to get some hard-earned sleep. We're going to start with what's going on in the US in terms of, my goodness, 3 or 4 days of quite a lot of activity and one could argue inactivity. So it started off with the House of Representatives failing to support a $17.6 billion aid bill for Israel. Okay, so the Republicans thought we'll split the Israel funding off from the border bill and we'll try and get that through. But Democrats are like, no, 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 that ain't going to happen without support for Ukraine as well. So the initiative to aid an ally in the war against Hamas received majority support, 250 votes to 180. However, the bill was considered under fast track procedures, which requires two-thirds support. So that didn't happen. That was a bit of an embarrassment for Republicans. Michael Weiss here, who's a reporter for Insider and for Yahoo News, said 3 of 4 GOP staffers in Congress called me about this bill, and they all said MAGA representatives were boasting about it as a poison pill designed to end Ukraine aid and force Democrats into backing it, lest they appear anti-Israel. Biden called their bluff, and the staffers are relieved. Mike Johnson himself came out with a statement about that. You can pause the video and read that if you want. It starts with the decision by President Biden and Leader Schumer to torpedo this bill to aid the Israeli people in their fight against Hamas is a disappointing rebuke to our closest ally in the Middle East at their time of great need. I mean, you could just reverse that onto Ukraine and see what he has to say about that. Anyway, less less reference to Johnson, the better. Then the Senate were it was put to the Senate to pass through the full scale bill again, the $118 billion immigration and foreign aid package bill with you know um, the new border policy, and that basically didn't get through. Senators threw in the towel Tuesday on a $118 billion national security and border package after sharp opposition from Republicans scuttled, indeed, the deal, forcing frustrated lawmakers to urgently seek for a backup plan to deliver aid to Ukraine. And then Tim White here saying that Chuck Schumer to push stripped down Israel and Ukraine aid bill after the GOP blocked. In fact, he's referring to the NBC News article here. So yeah, when they blocked the main bill, now it looks like there's this renewed bill for Israel, Ukraine, and Indo-Pacific aid. So it's taking out the border and looking at the kind of military aid packages as one thing. So the U.S. Senate will vote again today, and in fact that did pass. I think was it 67 to 32. So actually a pretty good margin that saw the aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan get through the Senate. Now, the Senate is the most likely of the two houses it will get through. The worry might well be Congress. So there's a lot of activity to try and get the funding through the House of Representatives, where the MAGA Republicans in the House have quite a bit of sway, more so than in the Senate. So all eyes on that. And indeed, today there's been an important arrival in Kiev. The train carrying a bipartisan delegation from the US Congress. Ukraine is desperate for Republicans to stop, as Tim White here says, being selfish or stupid, or just plain genocide supporters. So he feels very strongly about that. But the self-anointed leading free country in the world needs to protect freedom in Ukraine, says Tim White. And so Zelensky met here with delegation of the US Congress. One, I say here in Ukraine, I'm here. One of the topics was the financing of a $60 billion aid package to Ukraine, which Congress will continue to consider today. Republican Congressman Turner said that the US will fully approve funding for Ukraine, and I jolly well hope that is the case. So that's what's been happening in US Congress. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. It's all about getting that through the House of Representatives. So moving on to this very divisive topic, although from all the people I've spoken to, it's not divisive at all. Tucker Carlson is a plonker. It's that simple. Forgive me for reflagging this, says Tim White, but I think it's worth pointing out just how much this was just plain wrong. Tucker Carlson's claims ahead of the cozy chat with Putler. So what happened is he brought out this 4.5 minute set of misinformation talking about his forthcoming interview with Putin. I said that was lies the other day, and people were like, "Oh, how can you say it's lies when you haven't listened to the interview? It hasn't even been on. It hasn't been recorded yet. It was not on." No, this preamble was lies. As Jimmy Rushton says, who is worth listening to. So he's a foreign policy security analyst based in Kiev at the moment. He writes, "Imagine being such a pathological liar that even the Kremlin, the effing Kremlin, feels the need to call you out." So when Tucker Carlson made this 4.5 minute video where he made a bunch of claims, the Kremlin did a community notes fact check on him where he said no other journalist has even tried to interview Putin. And they're like, actually, I have. And then, Steve Rosenberg from BBC and like, yeah, we've tried to. And lots of other people like, yeah, we've tried to. And yeah, anyway, there was a really good analysis at this point by Ukraine the Latest podcast, which is Daily Telegraph, right leading newspaper, absolutely excoriating Carlson for some of his claims here, talking about how dare he call himself a journalist, how when et cetera, et cetera. And then you've got Evan Gershkovich, who's been arrested, and there he's like not at all talking to the idea that there's no freedom of speech. He was kind of talking about freedom of speech to be able to say that in the context of there being no freedom of speech in Russia and people being arrested for trying to report things. So he just has no clue, Tucker Carlson, no idea of the context in which he's operating. In fact, Pekka Kallioniemi does a really good sort of takedown of Putin here. I'm not going to go through it at the moment just because of time, but I mean, basically, Tucker Carlson is absolutely not to be trusted in the whole context of analysis and conversation concerning Ukraine and Russia. European Union is discussing the possibility of imposing sanctions against Tucker Carlson over an interview with Putin. According to Newsweek, former and current members of the European Parliament told the American magazine about this, and on Tuesday, Carlson, who arrived in Moscow, announced that he would soon release an interview with Putin. Former Belgian Prime Minister and current member of the European Parliament, Guy Verhofstadt, said that an interview with the Russian leader could turn Carlson into a target for EU legislators and called for consideration of introducing a travel ban for the scare quotes, in my opinion, journalist. Timothy Sider then said of the eventual 2-hour interview that came out, Putin just took a couple of hours to say, "I must destroy Ukraine because I have no idea what Russia is." Um, and someone here gives an analysis, Tucker. So it was about the US hit, Putin. No, let me explain. So it's the 8th century, right? And then Poland. And this guy says, as a Pole, I admit I had my doubts when I first heard we were buying 500 HIMARS, which are off the Americans. Now I start to think that this might not exactly be enough. So Putin just took the opportunity to just spout a load of demented history, quasi-history, and Tucker Carlson let him get away with it. Anyway, this is Ukraine the latest analysis of it the day after, and I think this is absolutely fascinating.
Francis Sternley, I'm going to come to you next. I think we've got to talk about it.
We do indeed, David, we do indeed. So let's get to it. The 2-hour interview with Vladimir Putin. I'll start with some of the key points. There's a lot to unpack here. So Roz, who joined us on the podcast yesterday, has written up a helpful summary of key moments, and I'll run through those quickly. Putin began by offering a more than 30-minute counterfactual history lesson to a rather bemused Tucker Carlson. His interjections, "How is this relevant, Mr. President?" were swiftly shot down by Putin, who said, "Are we going to have a serious talk or a show?" After a romp through history covering everything from Genghis Khan to the Roman Empire, trying to lay out his case for why Ukraine is Russian, he moved on, bizarrely, to offer his thoughts on the future of mankind. Mankind is currently facing many threats due to the genetic researchers. It is now possible to create this superhuman, a specialised human being, a genetically engineered athlete, scientist, military man. There are reports that Elon Musk has already had the chip implanted in the human brain in the USA. I think there's no stopping Musk. He'll do as he sees fit. He then added that an international agreement on how to regulate these things was needed to address the threat from the unbridled and uncontrolled development of AI or genetics in any other field. If you're not getting the picture yet, this was a rambling interview on a lot of different subjects. He then did get down to some of the dirtiest stuff, though. He was accusing the US of cheap provocation over its continued military aid to Kyiv and warned Washington against extending that support to deploying troops in Ukraine. If somebody has the desire to send regular troops, then that would certainly bring humanity to the brink of a very serious global conflict, he said. He continued that America should focus on its own domestic issues. Don't you have anything better to do? You have issues on the border, issues with migration, issues with the national debt, more than $33 billion. Wouldn't it be better to negotiate with Russia, make an agreement, already understanding the situation that is developing, realising that Russia will fight for its interests to the end? After that, he claimed that the CIA was behind the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. Asked by Carlson who blew it up, Putin replied, "You, for sure." Tucker joked he must have been busy that day. Putin replied, "The CIA has no such alibi." Asked whether he had evidence to support his claims, the Russian president said, "I won't go into details, but you should look for someone who is interested and who has the capabilities." Putin then repeated claims that it was the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson who sabotaged a peace deal with Ukraine that was being brokered with the assistance of Turkey in the spring of 2022. Carlson asked Putin about the reports that Ukraine was prevented from negotiating a peace settlement by the former British Prime Minister acting on behalf of the Biden administration. Suffice to say, Johnson has previously vehemently denied the claims as total nonsense and said he merely expressed concerns about the nature of the potential agreement during a conversation with Zelensky. So some of the key points there, David, but who was the intended audience? Americans who watch Tucker Carlson, most obviously, especially on that MAGA, more isolationist wing of the Republican Party. But there are also reports today that extracts are being shown in Russian classrooms. If so, I would assume it's because of that history section at the start, which plays into what textbooks now teach in schools, namely that Ukraine is not a state. Personally, I felt that what Carlson wanted Putin to say, and which he was almost steering him to say, frankly, was that the war was the West's fault due to broken promises, NATO expansion, that sort of thing. Incredibly, though, instead we saw the depth of Putin's conviction that Ukraine's history is merely Russian history. That's not anything new. He often makes these arguments and wrote that famous essay before the invasion laying out his case. But nevertheless, it was remarkable to see it relayed for so long, and especially given the audience. To me, at least, based on the audience the interview afforded, it was a missed opportunity, thankfully, for the Kremlin to spread its disinformation narrative that this conflict is all due to NATO encroachment, and as such, is a sort of misunderstanding.
I mean, what I think's absolutely fascinating here is I don't think the interview gave anything to Tucker Carlson's followers, and I don't think it really did anything for like the Putin Russian narrative that was what one might have expected. It's this kind of pseudo historical nonsense. I don't think anyone's particularly interested in a way that some, for example, MAGA Republicans might be. So there's nothing really for people to get up in arms about, and in that way, I think it was a bit of a failure. I mean, Tucker Carlson has just shown himself to be a Putin stooge here, but it's not been as damaging as it might otherwise have been.
As ever, what wasn't mentioned was as, if not more, interesting than what was. Putin didn't answer Carlson's question about whether he was satisfied with the territories he'd occupied so far. Instead, he drummed home that we haven't achieved our aims yet, because one of them is denazification. This means the prohibition of all kinds of neo-Nazi movements. As Svetlana Morinets writes in her analysis of the speech for The Spectator, there are many questions Carlson should have asked Putin but didn't. Why did his army bomb a theatre in Mariupol, killing up to 600 civilians? Didn't Putin claim that he started the invasion to protect the Russian-speaking population? What about mass graves in Izium and the massacre in Bucha? What about everyday missile attacks on civilian infrastructure over all of Ukraine? Carlson also didn't ask about the fates of more than 20,000 children who've been deported to Russia. He didn't question why Russia had disregarded the Minsk agreements or the Budapest Memorandum. He didn't even ask about Russia's internal issues. Why has Boris Nadezhdin, the anti-war candidate, been banned from participating in the upcoming presidential elections? Why is
That's something I haven't reported to you yet, of course. As expected, the chap who's going to run against Putin in the anti-war positioning in the presidential elections has been invalidated from running. They say that the Kremlin says 9,000 of his 100,000 signatures are invalid, which is exactly what we predicted would happen.
Navalny in jail? Why are Russians who dare to protest the war immediately arrested? That's before one even gets to the question of taste, David. Whilst humour can, of course, be an effective tool employed by journalists in interviews to try and get the truth out of their interviewees, there were moments where they were laughing together, which Carlson never acknowledged before or after the interview. That, to me, personally, given the enormity of the horror of the subject, was very telling.
He's absolutely right there. That is despicable. I mean, that's all you need to know about Tucker Carlson.
Sadly, though, I do think that whilst no masterpiece from a Putin propaganda perspective, it has served a purpose. As ever, the medium is the message. The medium itself saying that Russia is open for dialogue. That will appeal to Republicans in Congress. That will appeal to Donald Trump. And it may even appeal to those around Joe Biden who are increasingly concerned about his mental faculties. I said at the start of the episode that yesterday was historic. I believe the remarks by the special counsel saying that he's decided not to charge President Biden for his mishandling of classified documents because he's essentially not fit to stand trial was a bombshell. As he writes, he did not remember when he was vice president, forgetting on the first day of the interview when his term ended, and forgetting on the second day of the interview when his term began. He did not even remember when his son died, and his memory appeared hazy when describing the Afghanistan debate that was once so important to him. Among other things, he mistakenly said he had a difference of opinion with certain generals. In a case where the government must prove that Mr. Biden knew he had possession of the classified Afghanistan documents after the vice presidency and chose to keep those documents, knowing he was violating the law, we expect that at trial, his attorneys would emphasise these limitations in his recall. Extraordinarily, as our very own Tony Diver jumped on immediately, in a press conference designed to show he's still up to the job, Joe Biden committed another gaffe. On the Rafah crossing, he says, as you know, initially the president of Mexico, Sisi, did not want to open up the gate to allow humanitarian material to get in. Sisi is the president of Egypt, not Mexico. So, a day of wake-up calls, David. But how many of them are too late?
Well, thank you very much. Let's go then to our guest, Nate. Nate, you watched the whole interview. What's your reaction? And also, I'm interested in what your take on the reaction in Ukraine is as well.
Yeah, so first, I wanted to say thanks for having me on the show. I'm a big
This
fan,
is
long-time
worth
listener.
listening to.
Yes, I watched the whole interview this morning after many days of, I guess, frantic speculation about what might be said in it. And I mean, I think, honestly, it was rather disappointing overall. And even from the perspective of Putin, I think, as you said, it was a missed opportunity. I mean, this was 2 hours that started with 30 minutes of pseudo history. And if we're to look at who is the audience for this, I mean, the interview was in English. So we would assume that the audience is the Republican Party. I don't understand who would be listening to that. I mean, who would be making it through this first 30 minutes and then getting to the real meat of the conversation?
I think that's a really, really good point.
So I don't think that it. I mean, I don't think it was the bombshell that we all expected. I don't think Putin said anything necessarily new that he hadn't said before. And even Carlson displayed that he wasn't really paying attention to what Putin has said before about this pseudo history. I mean, Carlson, said that the case was first made in February 2022, not acknowledging this infamous essay that we've discussed before. So, and I guess if we look at the perspective from Tucker Carlson, I'm not sure what he got out of this either. I mean, it was pretty clear that Putin didn't take him seriously. And if you look at the reaction on Twitter and Ukrainian media, etc., it seems like people think that Putin was mocking him, and that's what most of the memes and so on about this are about. That's basically Tucker Carlson was outmatched and didn't push back at all. I mean, yes, about Gershkovich and so on, but the lightest pushback that we could imagine. Yeah, it's a lot of nonsense, really. At the end of the day, I think.
Nate, could I ask a little bit?
So I'm going to leave it there just to move on, but I think that pretty much sums up the flavour of it, to be honest. Now, speaking of Trump, as he was mentioned, it's interesting that Trump said in a speech recently or in an interview that he wants China to do great and is a big fan of Xi Jinping. And then the other day on a Newsmax interview, he said that the United States is, quote, so pathetic. It's really interesting, as Republicans against Trump says, why does he hate America so much? So he's always about make America great again, as if it's rubbish now. But if he consistently downplays America now, then of course it's going to be rubbish as far as his perception is concerned, because he is consistently just saying it's rubbish, just downplaying America rather than being really positive about America. It's just I really get that. I really understand this idea. Quite often you get such people saying, "Oh, why do the Democrats hate America so much?" and so on and so forth. But actually, when you listen to the rhetoric of someone like Trump, he's just always saying how crap everything is. I suppose that allows him to maneuver for making it great again. Anyway, speaking about China, leading Chinese bankers halted operations in Russia and Belarus. That is very interesting. So China's Suzhou commercial bank has notified its clients in Russia and Belarus that it's ending all of its operations there due to payment issues associated with Western sanctions. The Russian state-controlled media outlet Vedomosti reported on the 7th. Sources told Vodomosti that all payments have been impacted, not just those that use SWIFT. Zelensky's been invited to the Munich conference next week. That's the security conference in Munich, which is really good. The European Union has proposed sanctioning about 55 companies and more than 60 individuals as part of a new package of measures to mark 2 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. The restrictions would target individuals and firms involved in producing weapons and supplying key technologies and electronics used by Russian defense firms to build the armaments, according to documents seen by Bloomberg. This is really good, long overdue, but I think it's important that the EU aims at those providing components that eventually end up all the way over in Russia in their weapons. The German government is looking at the expropriation and nationalization, of Rosneft Deutschland, which is 100% owned by the Russian Rosneft Group. The Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action had already placed the company under fiduciary administration in September 2022, according to Handelsblatt, which is a German news source. Government circles reported that the Russian Rosneft Group was formally included in a corresponding hearing on Monday. The hearing proceeds expropriation and is part of the formal procedure. A decision will be made by March 2024. The purpose of expropriation is to guarantee Germany's oil supplies. This has incensed Russia, and this is a really good move, I think, from Germany. Germany's leader spells out the seriousness of the situation in a Wall Street Journal piece. Hopefully, voices in Europe can cause at least a few Republicans with a conscience to stop a tyrant and war criminal, says Tim White again. He's pretty incensed about the situation in the US. Schultz says Ukraine has serious weapons and ammo shortage. I can confirm that. I can give you first-hand information about how they do not have artillery ammunition. Speaking to someone today, So I've heard firsthand from Russian soldiers themselves, but I heard from a humanitarian worker today who's got two friends in artillery roles locally to where I am presently. And he said one of them's lost his job because he's got nothing to fire, so he's actually moved to a mortar crew because they've literally got no ammunition to fire from their artillery. And the other one fires basically nothing compared to what they did last year, which was during a counteroffensive where they're freely firing all sorts of rounds. And now at the present hardly has anything to fire at all. Literally does nothing. So it is absolutely critical. And it's critical, unfortunately, because of uh, mainly the inaction in Congress for the US, who were providing the lion's share of artillery ammunition. Now, the EU and other countries have stepped up production, but that's like turning a tanker. That takes an awful long time to kick in. And indeed, that's what's been said today by I think, some German and EU politicians, saying that actually it's not going to be for a long time until the EU can provide enough ammunition consistently for Ukraine, given that a lot of their production goes to other countries as well. UK has extended tariff-free trade with Ukraine until 2029, which is good. Latvia will not allow Russia to attack the European Union. Foreign Minister Karins has said in an interview with the Telegraph, according to the official, for this purpose, the country has returned conscription, which was abolished in 2007. Fascinating, and that shows you how serious this stuff is in the Baltics. Denmark and Ukraine have already started negotiations on security guarantees, so that's good news. Visit of Putin to Turkey, which was planned for February the 12th, has been postponed. Also hints that it might be cancelled fully. Very interesting. That was going to talk about the grain corridor, but of course, Ukraine don't really need a grain corridor up and running. They are at the pre-grain corridor levels with their exports along that new coastline hugging route that they have. The insider reports that Russia has launched a disinformation campaign in Africa, spreading the conspiracy that Western pharmaceutical companies and Microsoft co founder Bill Gates are conducting biological experiments in Africa under the cover of vaccination programs. And finally, Hungary and Poland are again causing problems on Ukraine's border, with farmers again starting protests blocking three Polish border crossings, um, and same with Hungarians, I think, doing that too in some of their border crossings as well. So, yeah, a bit of a challenge there for Ukrainian exports and imports. Anyway, that's enough from me for the geopolitical news. Sorry, it's been a long time in coming, and I hope the audio was just about acceptable for you. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Doodle pips.